Sir, you don't have the financial qualifications to even look at that vehicle, the dealership employee said loudly. His cold voice cut through the room, prompting everyone in the waiting area to turn and stare. The elderly man said nothing. He took a step back, still gripping his folder filled with documents for a used car loan. His jacket was faded, and his wooden cane shook in his hand. Another customer shook his head and let out a quiet chuckle. Someone like you should stick to the bus. But 4 hours later, 10 black military SUVs pulled up in front of the dealership, and no one was laughing anymore. He had only come to buy a used car. So why did a fleet of military SUVs arrive that Monday morning at Townridge Ford in suburban Kansas City? George Hall, a 79-year-old Marine Corps veteran, arrived wearing a worn jacket, leaning on his cane, and holding a folder with loan paperwork from the Veterans Bank. He had walked over 2 miles from his home to view a used Ford Escape SUV listed at $6,900. At the reception desk, he offered his credit history, veteran's ID, and a recommendation letter from the local Veterans Council. The employee, a man named Kyle in his early 30s, barely glanced at the documents and smiled dismissively. "You don't have an online account or email. How are we supposed to verify your information?" George responded softly. "I have a confirmation letter from the bank and all the proper paper documents." Kyle shook his head. "Don't waste your time. This vehicle isn't for people who are no longer working." People in the showroom turned. Some pressed their lips together in discomfort. Others lowered their gaze to avoid witnessing the exchange. A young professional muttered, "Probably living off government money and still can't make payments." George said nothing. He gathered his papers and stood calmly. As he passed the exit, he paused for a brief moment, his eyes fixed on the glass door, where his reflection stared back. Inside, business continued as usual. Salespeople hustled between desks, the coffee machine hummed, and phones rang with customer inquiries. It was as if nothing had happened. As if the old man's dignity hadn't just been stripped. Kyle had already moved on, greeting a well-dressed couple with his rehearsed grin. "Welcome to Townridge Ford. How can I make your automotive dreams come true today?" Outside, George carefully descended the 3 steps from the entrance, each one slow and deliberate, his bad knee and worn cane requiring full attention. The morning sunlight illuminated his threadbare jacket and the absence of medals that once adorned it. No one noticed him checking his wallet at the bus stop to ensure he had fare. No one saw him glance back at the shiny cars, not with envy, but with a familiar sense of quiet resignation. He had saved for 3 years for that down payment. The Ford Escape wasn't luxurious. It was reliable. A vehicle that would allow him to drive his neighbor's children to school when their mother worked double shifts, get to his volunteer job at the library without relying on the unpredictable bus, and visit his wife's grave every Sunday. Inside the folder were modest but consistent bank statements, a pension confirmation letter, and a perfect payment record on the mortgage he had just finished paying off. Also tucked inside, a faded photo of George in his Marine uniform next to a communications unit in Da Nang, 1968. When the bus arrived, George boarded with care. The driver waited patiently, offering no commentary. George took a seat near the front, placed his folder on his lap, and looked out the window, his reflection merging with the passing city. The same city he had once defended. Forgive my emotion in sharing this story. This was a man who once protected our freedom, now facing injustice. From 1967 to 1970, George served as a communications technician in Da Nang. During an ambush, he was the only survivor of his team after calling in a helicopter rescue just in time. He lost his first wife in a car crash in 1989 when his daughter, devastated by the loss, fell into substance abuse and disappeared. He raised his grandson alone. Despite his age, George remained an active neighbor, shoveling snow for the entire street, never requesting assistance, living on his pension and working part-time at the local library. Each year he raised the flag on Victory Day. Few knew that in his room was a wooden box containing a silver star and a recorded message of gratitude from his former commander. He never bragged. He never asked for recognition. Behind his weathered appearance was a life of quiet service and strength. He had battled nightmares for years after Vietnam, but rather than seek acknowledgement, he poured his efforts into rebuilding lives, starting with his own. His home was modest, neat. His small garden supplied vegetables he shared with elderly neighbors. His bookshelf held history and technical manuals. Framed on his wall, a single photograph of his unit taken just before the ambush. His wife, Eleanor, was his high school sweetheart. She had waited faithfully during his deployment, but they had only 20 years together before tragedy struck. Their daughter never recovered. Her son, David, became George's purpose. George raised David with integrity, not through words, but example. When David joined the military, George said only, "Serve with honor." The library job wasn't about money. It was about community. Children loved Mr. Hall, the man who could fix any book and guide them to adventure. Teens researching military service found deep conversations with the quiet man in the reference section. George hadn't even wanted an SUV. He had hoped for something smaller and more economical, but the Escape's higher clearance helped with his knee, and the fold-down seats made it easier to deliver donations to the veteran shelter. He had budgeted carefully, even leaving room for rising utilities and helping with David's education. In the wooden box by his bed were letters from families of fallen comrades. George had written to each, sharing memories of their loved ones. Some had responded, others hadn't. He kept them all. When asked about his service, George would simply say, "I did what was needed." That day, after leaving the dealership, George visited the library where his grandson was interning. David, now 24, a military communications officer stationed nearby, listened to the story and said, "Rest, Grandpa. Let me handle it." At a base near Fort Leavenworth, David sent a message. Within 3 hours, 10 officers, veterans, and unit commanders arrived at Town Ridge Ford in 10 black military SUVs. They parked at the entrance and stepped out in uniform. The dealership froze. The commanding officer entered first and asked loudly, "Who rejected George Hall, the man who saved the 1970 Expeditionary Force?" Kyle stammered, I didn't know who he was." The commander placed an envelope on the desk. "We're buying that SUV, and we demand a public apology in front of every staff member and customer present." Kyle, red-faced and trembling, apologized. The showroom burst into applause. The normal buzz of sales stopped. Customers and staff stood frozen. David stood behind the commander, his posture perfect, his gaze fixed on Kyle. Those who looked closely noticed the resemblance. The commander continued, "Mr. Hall came here with proper documentation and means. He was dismissed based on assumptions about his age and appearance." Kyle looked around desperately, but the manager stood back, arms crossed. "I'm sorry," Kyle mumbled. "Louder," the commander demanded. "Everyone heard you disrespect a Marine Corps veteran. Everyone should hear your apology." Kyle's voice cracked. "I apologize for my behavior toward Mr. Hall. It was disrespectful and unprofessional. I made assumptions that were wrong." One of the officers stepped forward, placing a folder on the desk with the vehicle's specs. "We'll take care of the paperwork. The vehicle will be delivered today." As Kyle processed the documents, hands trembling, David approached another officer who had photographed everything. They exchanged nods. The manager stepped forward. "On behalf of Town Ridge Ford, I want to extend our deepest apologies. This isn't how we train our staff." The commander replied, "Actions speak louder than words. We'll be watching." As the officers exited, the same young man who mocked George earlier approached David. "My grandfather served in Vietnam too," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." David nodded. Words mattered, but action would matter more. That afternoon, the used Ford Escape was delivered to George's home. On the seat was a handwritten note. "We can't give you back the years you gave, but we hope this helps you move forward with the respect you deserve." The next day, a wooden sign appeared at the dealership. "We were wrong. Thank you for letting us make it right." The video of 10 SUVs lined up went viral. The caption read, "Don't judge a veteran by his jacket, because the uniform may now live in his blood." George didn't use social media, but David told him. He just smiled and said, "As long as they remember the others, not just me." But the story didn't end there. 3 weeks later, the dealership hosted its first Veterans Appreciation Day, offering special financing and services. Kyle, rather than being fired, requested training with veteran support organizations to better understand the community he had misjudged. George's Ford Escape became a community vehicle, driving neighbors to appointments, delivering books, and hauling donations. In the back seat were care packages for deployed troops assembled by local kids. In George's wooden box, beside the silver star and the recording, now lay a Ford keychain and a note from David. For new journeys. It wasn't grand, but it was meaningful. A bridge between his service and his continued purpose. Most moving of all, during his first vehicle service, George found the dealership transformed. Veteran photos lined the walls. Resources for military families filled the waiting room. The respect he received felt real. David's commander turned the incident into a teaching moment. The battles our veterans face don't always end when they come home. Sometimes the hardest fight is for dignity in civilian life. Eventually, George's story became less about the confrontation and more about the community that responded, reminding us all that while one may disrespect, many will rise to restore honor. George never sought attention, but he knew this moment opened eyes. And sometimes that means more than any vehicle ever could. If this story touched you, maybe it's time we stop forgetting those who gave everything in silence. Subscribe to Hidden Sparks for more veteran stories and moments that still echo in our hearts.